Inside a giant sequoia in the heart of an ancient forest, a terrible secret had been kept for 2 decades. 4 people who had been missing for all that time were there. They hadn't just been killed, they had been hidden in a way that no one could ever have imagined. When the tree finally revealed its secret, it raised even more questions. August 23, 2020, Sequoia National Park, Northern California. 2 rangers, Dave and Sarah, were doing a routine patrol after a severe storm had swept through the region a couple of days earlier. The storm had knocked down several trees and broken many branches, and their job was to assess the damage and check the safety of the trails. They had been working in this park for several years and had seen it all, but this day would be the last day of their old lives. They turned off the main trail and headed deeper into the forest, to a part of the park where tourists rarely venture. The air was heavy, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. Ahead, they could see one of the giants, an old sequoia that all the local rangers called the king of the forest. The tree was enormous, at least 2,000 years old. The hurricane had not knocked it down, but it was severely damaged. About 10 meters above the ground, there was a fresh crack in the trunk, and at the very base, a large piece of bark had broken off, exposing a dark void inside. Redwoods are often hollow inside due to forest fires that burn out the core, but the tree continues to live. This was a common occurrence. The rangers moved closer to assess the extent of the damage and whether the tree posed a threat to visitors, even if they didn't come here often. Dave shone his flashlight into the hole at the roots. It wasn't very big, maybe a meter high. It was dark and damp inside. Then they smelled something. It wasn't just the smell of decay that was common in the forest. It was a different, sickening, sweetish smell of decomposition that was unmistakable. At first, they thought that some large animal had died inside. Perhaps a bear had crawled in and died. That had happened before. Dave asked Sarah to shine her flashlight too, so they could get a better look at what was inside. The beams of light picked out a pile of old rags, some trash and branches from the darkness. But then the light fell on something white and smooth, something that was too regular and round in shape. Dave froze. It was a human skull. He told Sarah to step back immediately and call the sheriff on the radio. He remained by the tree, unable to look away. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the trunk, he began to make out other details. Bones, lots of bones, ribs, vertebrae, and long bones from arms and legs. And they were mixed with the remains of clothing, a faded flannel shirt, a piece of denim, a rotting boot. It became clear that there was more than one person there. Panic began to set in, but Dave was an experienced ranger and forced himself to remain calm. He understood that he was at a crime scene and that nothing should be touched. An hour later, the first officers from the Tulare County Sheriff's Office arrived. The area was cordoned off. News of the discovery quickly reached park management and then the FBI, as the crime had been committed on federal land. The place turned into a hive of police, agents, and forensic scientists. The work was challenging. It was almost impossible to extract the remains from the narrow space inside the tree without damaging them or destroying evidence. Forensic scientists had to work for hours in uncomfortable positions, carefully, inch by inch, dismantling the horrific contents of the giant sequoia. They used special tools to hook bones and fragments of clothing. The work took almost 2 days. When it was finished, the results of the preliminary examination stunned everyone. Inside the tree were the remains of 4 people. 4. They had been stuffed in there on top of each other. The forensic experts working at the scene immediately said that the remains were ancient. Judging by the condition of the bones and the complete absence of soft tissue, they had been there not for a year or 2, but much longer, maybe 10, 15, or even 20 years. The remains were sent to the laboratory. A long and painstaking process of identification began. Anthropologists determined that there were 2 men and 2 women, all young, approximately 20 to 25 years old. The next step was to find out how they died. The answer was found quickly. 3 skulls showed clear signs of blunt force trauma inflicted by a heavy object. The 4th skull was more severely damaged, but the nature of the injuries pointed to the same conclusion. There was no doubt these people had been brutally murdered with blows to the head. Their deaths were not accidents. This was cold-blooded murder. 4 people had been killed, and their bodies hidden in the most secure, most unimaginable place, the heart of an ancient tree. The killer, whoever he was, must have known this forest well. He knew about this sequoia. He knew about its hollow interior. He knew that in this remote corner of the park they would probably never be found. And he was almost right. Now the investigators were faced with the primary task, to find out who these 4 people were. They had to dig up all the missing persons cases from the last few decades. It was a tremendous job. They started checking databases across California, then across the country. They were looking for groups of 4, 2 men, 2 women, who had gone missing in the area. Weeks went by. One by one, the leads dried up. Then, after nearly 2 months of working through the archives, one of the FBI analysts stumbled upon an old, dusty case file. September 1997. 4 friends from San Francisco, Mark Williams, 22, his girlfriend Jennifer Davis, 21, their friends Eric Muller, 23, and Chloe Banning, 22, went on a weekend camping trip to Sequoia National Park. They planned to hike one of the popular trails and return on Sunday evening. They never came back. On Monday, when none of them showed up for work or contacted their families raised the alarm. A massive search operation began. Hundreds of volunteers, rangers, police, and helicopters with thermal imaging cameras combed the forest week after week. The only thing they found was their car, an old Ford Explorer, parked in a parking lot at the start of the hiking trail. Inside the vehicle were wallets, some food, maps, everything they hadn't taken with them on their short hike. This indicated that they had intended to return, but they never did. The search continued for several months, but yielded absolutely nothing. No tents, no backpacks, not the slightest trace. It was as if 4 people had vanished into thin air in the middle of a vast forest. Eventually, the search was called off. The case was classified as unsolved. The parents of the missing spent years and all their savings on private investigators, but to no avail. To the rest of the world, Mark, Jennifer, Eric, and Chloe had vanished. And then, 23 years later, they were found. Investigators requested dental records for the missing and DNA samples from their aging parents. The examination confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains found in the trunk of a redwood tree belonged to 4 friends from San Francisco. The mystery of their disappearance had been solved, but in its place arose a new, even more terrifying one. Who killed the 4 young people, and why? And how did the killer manage to commit such a monstrous crime and hide the bodies so ingeniously that they could not be found for more than 20 years? The investigation, which had reached a dead end in 1997, began again. But now the investigators had something they did not have before: the bodies and the crime scene. And they started from the beginning by interviewing everyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual during those September days 23 years ago. They dug up old reports, found the names of rangers who were working in the park at the time, and tourists who had registered on the exact dates. Most were already retired or had moved away. But the investigators were determined to find any clue. They started calling people, and one of the first calls was to a former ranger who had been a shift supervisor in 1997 and one of the first to participate in the search. He told them something that hadn't made it into the official reports, a small but strange detail. He remembered that during the week the tourists disappeared, there had been some tension in the forest. The animals were acting restless. He also remembered one of his employees, a forester. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of the park. He was unsociable and withdrawn, but he knew his job perfectly. He knew the wildest and most remote parts of the forest better than anyone else. The forester's name was Robert Hawkins. In 2020, investigators immediately requested his file from the Park Service archives. What they found there made them realize they were on the right track. Robert Hawkins, 48 years old at the time of the events of 1997, had been hired 5 years earlier. His performance reviews were unremarkable. Efficient, knowledgeable, prefers to work alone. No disciplinary actions, no problems. But the most interesting detail was the date of his dismissal. Hawkins had not been fired. He was listed as absent without leave. The date of his last shift was Friday, September 12, 1997. That was the day when 4 friends arrived at the park and left their car in the parking lot. According to records, Hawkins was supposed to report to work the following Monday, but he didn't show up. They tried to call him on the radio, but there was no answer. 2 days later, when he still hadn't shown up, 2 rangers drove to his company cabin, which was located in a remote area several miles from the main tourist routes. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked as if the owner had stepped out for 5 minutes and was about to return. There was a plate of half-eaten food on the table next to an open book. His clothes were neatly folded on a chair, but Hawkins himself was nowhere to be found. His pickup truck, which was usually parked outside the house, was also gone. Some of his belongings were missing: his backpack, hunting rifle, and several sets of clothes. Back then, in 1997, the park management decided that Hawkins, this strange and unsociable man, had decided to give up everything and leave without saying goodbye. Such things happened. His disappearance and the disappearance of the tourists were not connected in any way. These were 2 separate events that co-occurred in a vast forest. But now, 23 years later, the coincidence seemed too sinister. FBI investigators began to dig deeper. Who was this Robert Hawkins? There was catastrophically little information. He had come to California from another state, Oregon. He had no wife or children. His file contained no relatives' contact information. He was a real ghost. The agent sent a request to the Armed Forces Archives. The response came a week later. Yes, Robert Hawkins had served in the Army, in the Engineering Corps, and had spent 2 tours in Vietnam. He had been awarded for excellent service, but had resigned of his own accord. There was one notable detail in his military record. His fellow soldiers described him as a man with an unstable character, prone to outbursts of anger, but at the same time incredibly cool-headed in stressful situations. After the Army, he disappeared for several years. He did not officially work anywhere and led a reclusive lifestyle. Then he showed up in California and got a job at a national park. Now the investigation had a working theory. 4 young, rowdy city dwellers could have accidentally stumbled upon Robert Hawkins while hiking. Perhaps they wandered onto his property and violated his privacy. Anything could have happened. One thing led to another, and a conflict broke out. Hawkins, with his military background and unstable psyche, could easily lose his temper. He was a strong, resilient man, accustomed to hard physical labor. Dealing with 4 unprepared tourists would be no problem for him. Then the veteran's cool head kicked in. He realized what he had done and knew he had to get rid of the bodies. And he came up with the perfect plan. He knew this forest like the back of his hand. He knew every tree, every cave. He knew about an old sequoia with a hollow inside. The hole at its base was small, but large enough to drag the bodies inside. It was hellish work, but he had time. No one saw or heard what happened in that remote area. After hiding the bodies, he returned to his cabin, calmly gathered the most necessary items, got into his pickup truck, and drove away. He disappeared, vanished. In 23 years, he never showed up anywhere. He didn't use his name, didn't get any tickets, and didn't seek medical attention. He either died shortly after his escape or lived all these years under a different name, leading the same quiet and inconspicuous life as before. The FBI placed Robert Hawkins on the federal wanted list on charges of 4 murders. His photo from his file, taken in the mid-1990s, was sent to all police stations across the country. Experts compiled a photo fit of what he might look like now, in his 70s. The case, which for decades had been considered a tragic disappearance, turned into a manhunt. Investigators returned again and again to the scene of the crime, to the giant sequoia tree. They tried to understand precisely how it had happened. Where exactly had Hawkins attacked the tourists? Where were their personal belongings, their tent, their backpacks? Most likely, he burned everything or buried it somewhere in the forest, making it impossible to find after so many years. They interviewed other tourists who were in the park that weekend. Many recalled seeing a group of 2 guys and 2 girls. They were laughing, taking pictures, and looked happy. No one saw them with the sullen forester. No one heard any screams. The forest kept the secret of that day safe. During the investigation, another detail emerged. One of Hawkins' former colleagues recalled that he was obsessed with order in his territory. He hated it when tourists left trash, made noise, or strayed from the paths. He could watch people from a distance for hours without saying a word, and his gaze made them feel uncomfortable. He considered the forest his own and the people uninvited guests. Could something as insignificant as loud music or an empty can left in a clearing cause such monstrous rage? For a normal person, no. But for someone with post-traumatic stress disorder who had lived in isolation for many years, any little thing could be a trigger. This version seemed the most likely, a simple coincidence. 4 friends found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering a man who was like a ticking time bomb. The parents of the victims, who had lived with agonizing uncertainty all these years, finally learned the truth about their children's fate. But this knowledge did not bring them relief. It only brought new pain. Their children had been killed, and the killer was still at large. They appeared on television, asking anyone who might know anything about Robert Hawkins to contact the police. They wanted one thing: justice. They wanted the man who had taken away what was most precious to them to be brought to justice. But months passed, and there was no news about Hawkins. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. FBI agents followed every lead, checked every tip. There were calls from different states, people claiming to have seen a man who looked like him. But every time, it wasn't him. The search had reached a dead end. The only hope was that Hawkins would make a mistake somewhere, or that someone who knew him by another name would see his photo on TV and recognize one of America's most wanted killers in their quiet neighbor. But he was too wise and too careful. He had learned to be invisible in the jungles of Vietnam and used that skill in his new life. The hunt for the ghost continued. The Sequoia Park murders remained front-page news, gradually becoming one of those dark American legends. Robert Hawkins became an almost mythical figure, a ghost that everyone was looking for, but no one could find. The FBI never stopped working. Agents used every technology available. They ran his old photo through aging software and compared it to millions of images from surveillance cameras, social media photos, and driver's license databases. There were no results. They retrieved several items from Hawkins' old house from the archives, from which they were able to extract his DNA, and uploaded it to genealogical databases in the hope of finding distant relatives who could lead them to him. Again, nothing. He was a man without roots, without connections, the perfect candidate to disappear forever. The investigators and journalists working on the case were divided into 2 camps. Some believed that Hawkins was long dead. He had probably committed suicide shortly after the murders, unable to bear the burden of his crimes, or simply died in an accident. Others were convinced that he was alive, that a man like him, cunning, cautious, with survival skills, could create a new identity for himself and now live somewhere in a quiet town, with none of his neighbors even suspecting that the nice old man who goes to the grocery store is a cold-blooded killer of 4 people. The FBI received calls periodically. Someone had seen a man who looked like him in Mexico, while others had seen him in Canada and Alaska. Each report was carefully checked, but they all turned out to be false. Hope faded with each passing year. It seemed that the world would never know what had become of Robert Hawkins. In early 2024, almost 4 years after the bodies were found, there was a surge of activity. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police received a report from a hunter in British Columbia. He told them about an old recluse who lived in the wilderness hundreds of miles from the nearest town. This man called himself by a different name, but his appearance, age, and habits were strikingly similar to the description of Robert Hawkins. He rarely interacted with people, was unsociable, and was rumored to be a Vietnam veteran. For the FBI, this was the most promising lead in the entire investigation. A joint operation was organized. A group of FBI agents flew to Canada. For several days, they worked with the Canadian police to conduct surveillance on the recluse's house. Everything matched. It had to be him. The decision was made to take him alive. Early in the morning, as the fog was beginning to lift over the forest, special forces surrounded the small house. The operation went quickly and without a single shot being fired. The sleepy old man was led out of the house. He did not resist but looked silently and in amazement at the armed men. He was immediately taken to the nearest base, where his fingerprints and a DNA sample were taken. Everyone waited in suspense. Had this long chase finally come to an end? The answer came a few hours later and was a cold shower for everyone. It wasn't Robert Hawkins. The fingerprints didn't match. The DNA analysis also came back negative. It was just another man, also with a difficult life, who had decided to escape from the world to the Canadian wilderness. For the investigation, it was a crushing blow. After this setback, the case stalled again. Public interest began to wane. It was turning into another cold case, an unsolved crime that would remain a scar on the park's history. And then, in the fall of that same year, 2024, the answer came from where no one expected it. In Nevada, far from the forests of California, 2 young people were engaged in extreme tourism. They were exploring a remote and almost uncharted canyon. When they reached the bottom, they stumbled upon a pile of rusty metal, embedded in the ground and almost entirely hidden by overgrown bushes. As they got closer, they realized that it was the remains of an ancient pickup truck. The vehicle had fallen off the edge of the canyon many years ago and crashed. It was an interesting find, but not that unusual in these wild places. They took a few photos and were about to move on when one of them noticed something white under the roots of a tree a few meters from the car. They were bones, human bones. They reported their find to the authorities. The sheriff and his team arrived at the scene. They examined the crash site. The pickup truck had been lying there for a very long time, at least 20, maybe 25 years. Although almost all the identification marks had rotted away, the forensic experts managed to find the frame number stamped on the metal. They ran it through the national database. A few hours later, a response came that sent a chill down everyone's spine. The Ford pickup truck, manufactured in 1989, was registered to Robert Hawkins. It was his car. Forensic experts carefully collected all the bones scattered around. Among the remains were a belt buckle, several buttons, and an old, rusty hunting knife. Everything pointed to the fact that it was him. DNA analysis conducted using bone material finally confirmed that the remains belonged to Robert Hawkins. Forensic experts reconstructed the scene of the crime. Most likely in late September or October 1997, just a few weeks after the murders, Hawkins was driving along this deserted mountain road, trying to escape. Perhaps he was careless, or maybe he lost control of the car on a brutal stretch of road. The car plunged into the abyss. He survived the fall, but was probably seriously injured and unable to get out of the canyon. He died there, alone, in the same wild wilderness where he had committed his crime. The man who had so skillfully hidden from justice was found entirely by accident. The case of the murder of 4 tourists in Sequoia National Park was officially closed. The killer had been found, and he was dead. The justice that the families of the victims had so long awaited had been served, but not in a courtroom. There were no answers to the question, why? There was no confession, no remorse, only bones in an unnamed canyon. The forest that had kept the secret of his victims for so long had finally taken him too, burying with him the truth about what had happened on that fateful September day.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.